Hello and welcome to North Star Oasis. I'm your host, Jeff Williams. Here we are on Halloween 2019. So where were you on January 31st, 1991? Do you remember that Halloween snowstorm from 28 years ago? Thankfully, this part of history is not repeating itself when I get out of the studio today. I don't expect to see 20 inches of snow on the ground and cold temperatures. This is Minnesota. I expect that now. But anyhow, happy Halloween. We are getting close to the completion of yet another year. And we're almost done with another season of North Star Oasis. Go figure. Another couple of weeks and we'll have another birthday. Nonetheless, speaking of history, sometimes history repeats itself, and I'm sure you've probably heard the old slogan, those who do not know their history are condemned to repeat it. Now, for the historian, there's a modification on that. Those who know their history are condemned to watch everybody else repeat it. It's a frightening thing. Well, we're going to take a look right now at something that happened a couple of years ago. It's the Iran nuclear deal, because we got an important anniversary coming up in the next couple of days, and we're going to cover that today. And so in order to understand the significance of what happened years or decades ago, we have to look at the here and now. Why is this important? Because the stuff that we're going to talk about in our Prager University segment has its roots going all the way back into the other areas of discussion. So we're going to take a look at our Prager University segment of today, the Iran nuclear deal. This should scare you, folks. Happy Halloween.
We say that evil is dark, but this metaphor is imprecise. Evil is actually intensely bright, so painfully bright that people look away from it. Many even deny its existence. Why? Because once people acknowledge evil's existence, they know they have to confront it. And most people prefer not to confront evil. That is what led to World War II and the death of 55 million people. Many in the West denied the darkness of Nazism. They looked the other way when that evil could have been stopped and then appeased it as it became stronger. We are reliving 1938, the year that democratic Western nations assured a police state, the Nazi regime, that they would do nothing to prevent its expansion. That year, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, went to Munich to negotiate with Adolf Hitler. He left believing Hitler's promises of peace in exchange for Germany being allowed to annex large parts of Czechoslovakia. Upon returning to England, Chamberlain announced, "Peace for our time." The 2015 agreement between America, Europe, Russia, China, and Iran mirrors 1938. The Nazi regime was a police state. The Islamic Republic of Iran is a police state. The Nazis' greatest aim was to exterminate the Jews of Europe. Iran's greatest aim is to exterminate the Jewish state. The West dismissed Hitler as the Jews' problem. The West dismisses Iran as Israel's problem. Nazi Germany hated the West and its freedoms. The Islamic Republic of Iran hates the West and its freedoms. Germany sought to dominate Europe. Iran seeks to dominate the Middle East and the Muslim world. And just as Britain and France appeased Nazi Germany, the same two countries, along with the United States, have chosen to appease Iran. In fact, there's considerably less defense for the Iran agreement, which awards Iran $150 billion in currently frozen assets and the right to keep its nuclear program, than there was for the Munich Agreement. Prior to 1938, Hitler had not publicly proclaimed his aim to annihilate Europe's Jews. Yet Iran has been proclaiming its intention to annihilate the Jewish state for decades. There were no massive death to America demonstrations in Germany, as there regularly are in Iran. In 1938, Germany had not been responsible for terror around the world, as Iran is now. Nor was Germany responsible for the death of more than 1,000 Americans, as Iran has been in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Lebanon. The Neville Chamberlains of 2015 defend the agreement with Iran on two grounds: that the only alternative is war, and that this agreement has the capacity to bring Iran into the, quote, community of nations. The war argument is a falsehood for three reasons. First, the alternative to this agreement was continuing and tightening the sanctions that were weakening the Iranian regime and greatly diminishing its ability to fund terror groups around the world. Second, because the agreement so strengthens Iran, it makes war far more likely. When evil expansionist regimes get richer, they don't spend their wealth on building new hospitals. They expand. Third, Iran has been at war with America for decades. And whoever believes that the agreement will bring Iran into the, quote, community of nations betrays a breathtaking ignorance of the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is composed of religious fanatics who are morally indistinguishable from ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, and all the other mass-murdering Islamist movements. The Iranian regime has executed more people than any country except China and killed more than 6,000 Iranians just for being homosexual. A woman in Iran is not allowed to leave the country without the permission of her husband. The Iranian regime repeatedly calls for the extermination of Israel. No other country in the world is committed to annihilating another country. Iran is already the world's greatest funder of terror organizations. Imagine what it will do with another $150 billion. Imagine what it will do with the removal of the current weapons and missile embargo. Imagine what it will do with its intact nuclear infrastructure. This deal allows all three. Very few people have a chance to do something about the greatest evil of their time. When it votes on this agreement, the American Congress has that chance. I'm Dennis Prager.
So that's kind of an more up-to-date version of what's going on with the U.S. and the Western ideals versus Iran. Now that, of course, was a couple of years old when that video was put together, but nonetheless, it should serve as a good framework to understand or to see where we're leading up to in historical events. Because next week, or coming up in early next week, on November 4th, will mark the 40th anniversary of the Iran hostage crisis. And that really had a fundamental change in U.S. involvement in the Middle East. Had a lot of ramifications over things that have happened for the last 40 years. We had more of a presence in Lebanon. 1983, we had the Beirut bombing. We had airlines hijacked over their TWA Flight 847 in 1985. Then, of course, we had Desert Shield and Desert Storm that occurred right after the Iran-Iraq War ended, or a couple of years after. The Iran-Iraq War, of course, we were backing one side because we didn't like what the other side was doing. And then that, of course, led to 9/11, which led to Operations Rocky Freedom and Enduring Freedom. And then the pullout out of Iraq led directly to ISIS, which is what we're still dealing with today. Within this last week, we had the head of ISIS. He blew himself up. This is right after we had an agreement from President Trump that the U.S. forces are going to pull out of Syria, much to the chagrin of any never-Trumper and Democrat who thinks that we ought to stay in the region, even though in 2004 they campaigned to send all the troops home, every single one. So where did all of that start in the modern era? Really, technically, it was 1953. One of these clips is actually going to show that, but we're not going to dwell on that. But we're going to take a look right now at the history of Iran's revolutions, crash course world history.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're talking about Iran. Oh, Mr. Green, I know that country. It's in the Middle East. It's with Egypt. Nope, me from the past. We're going to talk about Iran. Now, I used to be you, so I remember when you would look at this part of the world and you would be like, oh yeah, that's a thing. And in your case, that thing extended more or less from, I guess, like Western China to, like, Poland. Then you'd make a bunch of broad generalizations about that area and no doubt use the terms Arab and Muslim interchangeably. But as usual, me from the past, the truth resists simplicity. So today we are going to talk about Iran, and just Iran, specifically the 1979 Iranian Revolution. So the 1979 Iranian Revolution and its aftermath are often seen by detractors as the first step in the creation of an isolated, fundamentalist state that supports terrorism, and you might be surprised to hear me say that there is some truth to that interpretation. That said, the way you think about the Iranian Revolution depends a lot on which part of it you're looking at, and regardless, it's very important because it represents a different kind of revolution from the ones that we usually talk about. So the 1979 uprisings were aimed at getting rid of the Pahlavi dynasty, which sounds like impressive, but this dynasty had only had two kings, Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah. Before the Pahlavis, Iran was ruled by the Qajar dynasty, and before that, the Safavids. The Safavids and Qajars were responsible for two of the most important aspects of Iran. The Safavids made Shia Islam the official state religion, starting with Ismail I in 1501, and the Qajars gave the Muslim clergy, the ulama, political power. So most of the world's Muslims are Sunnis, but the Shia, or Shiites, are an important sect that began very early on, around 680 CE, and today form the majority of Muslims in Iran and Iraq. Now, within both Sunni and Shia, there are further divisions and many sects, but we're just going to talk about, like, the historical difference between the two. Shia Muslims believe that Ali should have been the first caliph. Sunni Muslims think that Abu Bakr, who was the first caliph, was rightly chosen. Since that disagreement, there have been many others, many doctrinal differences, but what's most important is that from the very beginning, Shia Muslims saw themselves as the party of the oppressed, standing up against the wealthy and powerful, and hearkening back to the social justice standard that was set by the Prophet. And this connection between religious faith and social justice was extremely important to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and also to previous revolutions in Iran. This is really crucial to understand because many historians argue that the Iranian Revolution represents what the journalist Christian Carroll called an odd fusion of Islam and late 20th century revolutionary politics. But actually, in the scheme of Iranian history, it's not so odd. Because 1979 was not Iran's first revolution. The first major one was in 1906. It forced the ruling Qajars to accept a constitution. It created a parliament and supposedly some limits on the king and made Shia Islam the official state religion, but it also protected the rights of minorities in Iran. It ultimately failed partly because the clergy withdrew their support, partly because the Shah worked very actively against it, and maybe most importantly because the Russians and the British worked to keep Persia weak so they could continue to try to dominate the region. Which reminds me that most people in Iran are not Arabs, they are Persian. And most people in Iran don't speak Arabic, they speak Farsi, or as we often call it in English, Persian. So after World War I, European rivalries really heated up because of the discovery of oil in the Middle East. The British established the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which would later come to be known as BP. They also extracted a bunch of concessions from the Iranian government, in addition to extracting lots of oil. And they helped to engineer a change in dynasty by supporting the military commander Reza Khan in his coup in February 1921. Reza Khan became Reza Shah, and then he attempted to turn Persia, which he renamed Iran in 1935, into a modern, secular, Western-style state, kind of like Turkey was under Ataturk. But Reza Shah is perhaps best remembered for his over-the-top dictatorial repression, which turned the clergy against him. Okay, so during World War II, Reza Shah abdicated, and his young son Mohammad Reza Shah became the leader of Iran, which he remained mostly until 1979, when he definitely stopped being the leader of Iran. So after World War II, the British allowed greater popular participation in Iran's government. The main party to benefit from this openness was Tudeh, the Iranian Communist Party. Mohammad Mossadegh was elected prime minister in 1951 and led the parliament to nationalize Iran's oil industry, and that was the end of the democratic experiment. Now, most history books say that in 1953, the British and the CIA engineered a coup to remove Mossadegh from office. And that is quite possibly true. It is definitely true that we tried to engineer a coup. It's also true that Mossadegh quit and fled Iran following demonstrations against him. But we also know that the Shia clergy encouraged those demonstrations. That's a bit of a weird decision for the clergy, considering that Shia Islam traditionally takes a radical stance against oppression. But it's important to remember that Mossadegh was supported by the Tudeh party, and they were communists. Nationalization of the oil industry was one thing, but a further shift toward communism might mean appropriation of the land that supported the clergy, maybe even a rejection of religion altogether. So now we've seen two occasions where the Shia clergy's support helped facilitate change, right? In 1906 and again in 1953. So let's flash ahead to 1979. The Shah was definitely an autocrat, and he employed a ruthless secret police called the Savak to stifle dissent. In 1975, the Shah abolished Iran's two political parties and replaced them with one party, the Resurgence Party. You'll never guess who was resurging: the Shah. There was a huge round of censorship and arrests and torture of political prisoners, signaling that autocracy was in Iran to stay. But before those events in 1975, say between 1962 and 1975, by most economic and social measures, Iran saw huge improvements. In 1963, the Shah had tried to institute what he called a white revolution, top-down modernization led by the monarchy, and in many ways he was successful, especially in improving industry and education. Oil revenues rose from $555 million in 1964 to $20 billion in 1976. And the Shah's government invested a lot of that money in infrastructure and education. The population grew, infant mortality fell, a new professional middle class arose. But the White Revolution wasn't universally popular. For instance, it was opposed by one particular Shia cleric, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini spoke out against the White Revolution from the religious center of Iran, Qom. One of his main complaints was that the reforms would grant more rights to women, including the right to vote, but he also attacked the government for, quote, the rigging of elections and other constitutional abuses, neglect of the poor, and the sale of oil to Israel. And in general, Khomeini felt that a king's power was inherently un-Islamic and that Shia tradition was to fight that power. That noted about Khomeini, the 1979 revolution didn't start out to create an Islamic state. At first, it was a pretty typical uprising by dissatisfied Iranians to overthrow a government that they perceived as corrupt and unresponsive to their needs. In spite of, or arguably because of, oil-fueled economic growth, many Iranians weren't enjoying economic success. The universities were turning out more graduates than there were jobs, and the mechanization of agriculture had the predictable result of displacing farmers who moved to cities, especially the capital city of Tehran, where there weren't nearly enough jobs for the number of people. So I think it's unfair to say that a majority of the demonstrators who took to the streets in late 1978 were motivated by a fundamentalist vision of Islam. They were dissatisfied with economic inequality and political repression and a corrupt regime. So why do we generally remember the 1979 revolution as having been motivated by Shia Islam? Well, let's go to the thought bubble. So the initial demonstrations did begin after an Iranian newspaper on January 7, 1978 published an article that was critical of Khomeini. By the way, at the time he was living in Paris. These initial demonstrations were pretty small, but when the government police and army forces started firing on demonstrators, killing some of them, the protests grew. Each time marchers protested against the violent treatment to demonstrators, the government would crack down, and their violent reaction would spur more demonstrations. There was also a lot of criticism of the West tied up in the revolution. According to one woman who participated, American lifestyles had come to be imposed as an ideal, the ultimate goal. Americanism was the model. American popular culture, books, magazines, film had swept over our country like a flood. We found ourselves wondering, is there any room for our own culture? The Shah never understood why so many people were protesting against him. He thought that they were communists or being supported by the British. He also thought that merely bringing prosperity would be enough to keep him in power. It wasn't. On January 16, 1979, he left Iran. He eventually ended up in the US, which had unfortunate consequences for diplomatic relations between the US and Iran. But the point here is that the first part of the Iranian Revolution was relatively peaceful protests followed by a government crackdown, more protests that eventually led to the collapse of the monarchy. And that looks kind of familiar, especially if you've studied like the French French or Russian or even the American revolutions. And most historians argue these protests weren't about Islam, but rather the discontent over living conditions, pay cuts, and the threat of unemployment fused with the general disillusionment and anger with the regime. The government that eventually replaced the monarchy was the second, and in many ways much more revolutionary revolution. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So the new Islamic Republic of Iran was based on Khomeini's idea about what an Islamic government should be, a principle he called Velayat-e-Faqih. Mainly, it was that a Sharia law scholar would have ultimate authority because he was more knowledgeable than anyone about law and justice. There would be a legislature and a president and a prime minister, but any of their decisions could be overturned by the supreme ruler, who from 1979 until his death was Khomeini. Now, if democracy is only about holding elections, then the new Iran was a democracy. I mean, Iran has elections, both for president and for the parliament. And for the record, despite what Khomeini might have thought in the 60s, women can vote in Iran, and they do. They also serve in the parliament and in the president's cabinet. And in the referendum on whether to create an Islamic Republic of Iran, the vast majority of Iranians, in a free and open vote, voted yes. Now, governance in Iran is extremely complicated, too complicated for one Crash Course video. But in one sense, at least, Iran is definitely not a democracy. The ultimate authority written into the constitution is not the will of the people, but God, who is represented by the supreme religious leader. And the actions of the Islamic Republic, especially in the early chaotic days of 1979, but also many times since, don't conform to most ideas of effective democracy. Like, one of the first things that Khomeini did to shore up his support was to create the Islamic Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah to defend the revolution against coup attempts. Although initially there were opposition parties, their activities were curtailed by the new revolutionary courts that applied Sharia law in a particularly harsh fashion. Like, it's estimated that by October 1979, several hundred people had been executed. And under the new constitution, Khomeini was given extensive power. I mean, he could appoint the heads of the armed services and the Revolutionary Guard and the national TV and radio stations. He also approved the candidates for presidential elections and appointed 6 of the 12 members of the Guardian Council that approved legislation from the parliament before it became law. So structurally, Iran's government looked kind of like other governments, but as Michael Axworthy points out, it was different because, quote, above and beyond stood the Faqih, with the power and the responsibility to intervene directly in the name of Islam, indeed with powers greater than those given to most monarchs in constitutional monarchies. By 1979, Iran already had a long history of clerical involvement in protest and dynamic change, but it also had a long history of pushing for constitutions and liberty. The current end result is the Islamic Republic of Iran, but it's worth remembering that both those threads of history are still part of Iranian life. Like, we saw that in 2009 and 2010 with the so-called Green Revolution, where there were huge protests after an Iranian election. Those protests involved young people arguing for more rights and liberties, but they were also led by and encouraged by reformist Shia clerics. In the US, we mostly remember the 1979 Iranian Revolution for its burning of American flags and taking of hostages in the American embassy. That belonged more to the second phase of the revolution, the chaotic period when the Islamic Republic was being born. Life in the Islamic Republic of Iran remains highly repressive. I mean, for instance, Iran still executes a very high percentage of criminals. But it's inaccurate to say that Iran is merely a dictatorship or that it's merely repressive. And one of the challenges for people in the West trying to understand Iran is that we have to disentangle the various aspects of the revolution rather than simply relying on the images that have defined it for us. I hope this episode can help a little. You can find more resources in the links below. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is filmed here in the chat.
So I hope you learned a little bit there. I don't expect you to become an expert after, because they covered a lot on that. Man, I was blown away when I watched that. You know, I'd known a fair amount of material prior to my watching of that, but man, they had stuff in there that I didn't even realize. But nonetheless, that kind of brought us to 1979. What was going on with the Iran Revolution? So then, kind of that next incarnation wasn't the January and February of 79 stuff that went on. November 4th, 1979. Students took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and captured hostages. And it was something that had a profound effect in the 1980 elections. This is actually, I think, the biggest contributors to why Jimmy Carter lost. There were really two contributing factors to why Jimmy Carter lost in 1980. Number one was the Iran hostage crisis. Number two was the strength of the economy, or lack thereof. People had looked at President Carter, and both Democrats and Republicans, it wasn't just one party looking at it this way, that President Carter was incompetent. He wasn't strong, he was weak, we were getting pushed around. Carter was a small town peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, who had no business trying to run the United States government. That was the attitude. I was, 8 years old at the time that this happened? And that was the attitude I remember. In my community, there were a lot of people who were of both parties. I had Republicans who hated Carter. I had Democrats who hated Carter. They did not like him by 1980. And nonetheless, this was what was being drummed in and day out, the Iran hostage crisis. And if Carter would have done things differently, then perhaps he could have survived the 1980 election, but history will show that he didn't. So now let's take a look at the history of the Iran hostage crisis.
On November the 4th, 1979, the year's main event unfolded as Islamic student militants overran the American embassy in Tehran, Iran, and held 52 of the embassy's staff hostage for a terrifying 444 days. It was the beginning of a crisis that lasted through to the end of President Jimmy Carter's term in office. The siege, during the chaotic aftermath of Iran's Islamic Revolution, had a dramatic effect on domestic politics in the United States and poisoned American-Iranian relations for decades. In Iran, it was seen as a blow against America and its long-standing support of the Shah of Iran. The Shah had been restored to power by a CIA-funded coup in 1953 in a plan conceived and executed by the US embassy staff in Tehran. The overthrow of the Shah by an Islamic revolutionary government earlier in 1979 led to a steady deterioration in relations between the two countries. As the Shah was admitted into the United States for cancer treatment, riots broke out outside the American embassy in Tehran. On the morning of November the 4th, about 500 students, known as Iran's Disciples, stormed the compound. After a short siege, they took more than 60 people hostage. Although women and African Americans were released, 52 hostages remained imprisoned. It wasn't until months later that Iran issued a list of demands in return for the release of their American hostages. They included an apology for American involvement in Iran, specifically the coup of 1953, and an undertaking to steer clear of Iranian affairs in the future. They also wanted the Shah's return to Iran to face trial. American President Jimmy Carter refused the demands and froze all Iranian assets in the US as he pursued political and economic measures to secure the release of the hostages.
I am not going to take any military action that would cause bloodshed or arouse the unstable captors of our hostages to attack them or to punish them. I'm going to be very moderate, very cautious, guided and supported and advised by Secretary Vance. Our purpose is to get the hostages home and get them safe. That's my total commitment, and I know you join with me as full partners in this effort.
The President authorized an ill-fated rescue mission to be named Operation Eagle Claw on April 24, 1979. But during an en route refueling stop, one of the large and heavily equipped US Army transport helicopters collided with a refueling aircraft on a remote desert airstrip, killing 8 US servicemen. The mission was aborted. President Carter suffered a major diplomatic blow, and the failed mission would ultimately contribute to his election defeat. On January the 20th, 1981, minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president, the hostages were released into US custody, and they arrived home to a ticker-tape parade through the streets of New York City. After months of negotiations, and helped by the Shah's death, American diplomacy had won through at a price. They agreed to unfreeze Iranian assets worth $8 billion and give the hostage-takers immunity. It had lasted 444 days and dominated thought, politics, and media reports around the globe. The Iranian hostage crisis would shape America's foreign and military policy in future years and was the beginning of a hostile relationship between the two countries that lasts to this day.
And there you have it. So that's what happened in 1979 with the Iran hostage crisis. And one of the things that sprung out of that was a TV program called Nightline. I believe that was on, what, ABC? I remember Ted Koppel would come on. Again, this is 8-year-old me, just kind of feeling my way through foreign affairs. This is one of the things kind of led me to becoming a historian as I was paying attention to all this stuff when I was growing up. And then by the time I got into high school, it's like, well, yeah, I kind of knew that because I remembered it. I was interested in it, in understanding it. And every night, this guy would come on TV. Hi, I'm Ted Koppel. You're watching Nightline. Today is day number 223 of the Iran hostage crisis. And every day we're like, wow, they haven't fixed that yet? They haven't resolved that? Well, here's Ted Koppel discussing his role in Nightline and the Iran hostage crisis.
This was, you have to recall, the time. Late 1979, President Carter was actually being challenged by Teddy Kennedy from within his own party. Kennedy was going to make a run for the presidency himself, and the fact that Jimmy Carter could show himself to be President of the United States, dealing with a national crisis that everyone in the country cared about, and everyone in the country did. They really wanted those hostages back. And, you know, tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree became not just an anthem. People were tying, that's when they began tying yellow ribbons around the old oak trees and telephone poles and mailboxes all over the country to bring those hostages home. So the White House began giving not one press briefing a day, but 2 press briefings a day. And the State Department gave 2 press briefings a day. They loved the publicity to begin with. It was only after a month or so that they began to see that, this isn't working out so well. We don't know how we're going to get those hostages out. And it may be a while before we get them out. And here was ABC putting this program on, which from the very earliest days came on with America held hostage, day 9, day 10, day 30, day 40. And all of a sudden, every one of those, and then Walter Cronkite picked it up. And he started doing it on the CBS Evening News, the hostage crisis, day 48, day 110. So they hated it after the first month or two, but they helped create it during the first month when the president's people announced what they called their Rose Garden strategy. The president wasn't going to leave the White House until this thing was over. Well, it was the stupidest thing they could have done, because by announcing the Rose Garden strategy, what they had said to the hostage holders in Tehran was, we're, president ain't moving. You've got the world's attention, which was exactly what the Iranian hostage takers wanted. And furthermore, they put out the word that we're not going to do anything to endanger the lives of the hostages. Now put yourself into the shoes of the hostage takers. Washington is saying, let me see if I got this straight. They're not going to do anything to endanger the lives of the hostages, so we don't have to worry about an invasion. And the president thinks about them first thing in the morning, last thing at night, and he's not going to leave the White House until this thing is over. We've got these guys nailed to the wall. I mean, this thing is the best publicity we could have dreamed of. And of course it was. But here we are almost 26 years later, and U.S. relations with Iran are still in the sewer, which probably doesn't work to the advantage of either country. First of all, you had people like Jody Powell and Harding Carter, who were the spokespeople at the White House and the State Department, respectively, and they are awfully decent and intelligent men who I think realized that they were in a trap of their own making, because America, it turned out, was held hostage by those 52 men and women who were being held in, I mean, you know, by the people who were holding the 52 men and women in Tehran. It made it terribly, terribly difficult for the United States to do anything. The presidency was held hostage, and indeed, I think it can be argued that it was because of this image of Jimmy Carter as an ineffectual president who wasn't able to do anything to get those hostages out of there in a proactive way. And you remember there was a military operation that was referred to as Operation Blue Light, I think, where a helicopter went down in the desert and a number of American servicemen were killed. So even when the president did try to take action, it backfired because we lost a lot of American servicemen over there and still didn't get the hostages out. And then, of course, the Iranians waited until quite literally the minute after the Carter presidency was over, and quite literally as Ronald Reagan was being sworn in as the next president of the United States, is when they gave word to allow the plane with the hostages to take off.
So there is Ted Koppel's perspective on what happened with the Iran hostage crisis. So those were quite interesting days for those of us who had lived through them, especially with that daily countdown. And I will tell you this, that it was quite a relief when it was all over. But it was also some scary times in that April 1980 Operation Eagle Claw, when we find out that the mission was a failure. And there were a lot of jokes that were thrown out, and some of them were including very, very unfair to the president. One was, well, why should we elect Jimmy Carter because he can't even get 6 helicopters to fly across the desert? I remember hearing that loud and clear, and I will say that in my Air Force career, I had the distinct honor of actually talking to some of the guys who were on that mission. I had a running correspondence based upon some photographs I had taken. I was in Masira Island, Oman, which is where Operation Eagle Claw had staged from. That's where the mission had taken off. All the C-130s and the helicopters, they all left Masira Island. And when I was there in 2003, there was a memorial to those who perished in Operation Eagle Claw. And it caught my eye because I remembered when Eagle Claw, also known as Desert One, I remember when that happened. And so I took photos of this memorial, and then I posted them on our internal server. And a friend of mine was a young airman. When he was a young airman, he actually had done some maintenance work in preparation for that, and he knew of some of the people there. So he forwarded my photos on, and I got a really nice email thanking me for that. But I'll tell you, it took me then a lot more reading onto what actually happened to find out that you can't blame Jimmy Carter for Operation Eagle Claw's failure. And one of the triumphs that came out of Operation Eagle Claw was the fact that we were able to learn about how to maintain our equipment in the desert environment, which later on saved lives in the Middle East in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Iraqi Freedom, and Enduring Freedom. It saved a lot of lives because of the lessons that we learned the hard way in that 1980 operation. So we're going to take a look right now at an Al Jazeera story on an anniversary of Operation Eagle Claw. This is from a couple of years ago.
The former American embassy in Tehran. Iranians called it the spy nest, referring to the intelligence activities carried out on its premises. But it was also the target of a US rescue mission in April 1980, Operation Eagle Claw. Initially meant to rescue 52 American diplomats and embassy staff who had been held hostage in the embassy since November 1979. 90 Delta Force commandos, 8 helicopters and 6 Hercules aircraft took part. The plan made complete sense on paper and during rehearsals, but the operation ended in disaster.
It was very elaborate and eventually went nowhere. But I did hear about, I was following it because at one point it looked like this was actually going to amount to something. I did learn about the rescue mission in April through a stolen newspaper. So what I could overhear, what they might let drop.
The aircrafts landed in a deserted airport near the eastern Iranian city of Tabas. A blinding sandstorm then kicked up. One of the helicopters hit a fuel-carrying airplane and exploded. Iran says the operation was designed to solve the hostage crisis and pave the way for a coup against the newly installed government. Instead, it further complicated the crisis.
The rescue attempt failed. That meant to me, and I'm almost sure to everyone else in the cell, that meant that we were going to be here longer, much longer than we might have been.
The hostage crisis lasted for 444 days, with the hostages only being released in January 1981. Iranians keep parts of the crashed helicopters on display. It may remind military analysts of how perfect plans may fall through on the ground, but it has a totally different meaning in the eyes of many Iranians. Iran was in a very difficult situation in April 1980. A new president had just been elected following resignation of the provisional government after the hostage crisis. Daily clashes with ethnic and political groups threatened the existence of the newborn Islamic Republic. The last thing it needed was the embarrassing success of any US snatch squad. That may be why Iranians agree with their late leader Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini that Operation Eagle Claw was crushed by divine intervention.
Imam Khomeini was right. He said what the Quran says about God's assistance for the faithful. We could not defeat Americans with all their weapons. It must have been God who did it.
Iranian leaders keep insisting that Iran is God's country and it will be assisted by divine intervention when most in need. And in the face of serious economic and political challenges, some say it's about time for another miracle. Ali Reza Ronaghi, Al Jazeera, Tehran.
So, Operation Eagle Claw, I don't think... I'm going to take a look at those who had perished in that effort, if I can pull that list up. And it doesn't... yeah, there it is. In the ensuing explosion and fire, 8 service members died, 5 of 14 Air Force C-130 aircrew, and 3 of the 5 Marine Corps aircrew in the helicopter, with only the helicopter's pilot and co-pilot, who were both badly burned, had survived. And in just a second here, I might be able to pull up their names. So as we look around, does this have their names? 3 Marines, Sergeant John D. Harvey of Roanoke, Virginia, Corporal George N. Holmes, Jr., Pine Bluff, Arkansas, Staff Sergeant Dewey Johnson of Dublin, Georgia, had perished in the incident, and 5 Air Force members, Major Richard Backey of Long Beach, California, Major Harold Lewis, Jr. of Fort Walton Beach, Florida, Technical Sergeant Joel C. Mayo of Harrisville, Michigan, Captain Lynn D. McIntosh of Valdosta, Georgia, and Captain Charles D. McMillan of Corryton, Tennessee. They all perished in Operation Desert One, and it's important to at least acknowledge their losses, that their memories still live on. So that, as we saw, meant that the hostages were still going to be there even later. But then finally, 1981, they returned. Now, I remember that when they were released, they went to Algiers, Algeria first. And they were there for a little while, for a couple of weeks, and then in February of 1981, they finally set foot on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, right outside of Washington, D.C. And we're going to show you now some news footage of that triumphant day.
Metro Media 5's Jackson Bain has that report.
Dolores, they closed off Andrews Air Force Base to the public this morning, but that didn't stop almost 10,000 base employees and their families turning out to give the 52 returned Americans a loud and long welcome to Washington. The 4 Air Force planes began landing shortly before noon today, dropping down out of a cloudy sky to a mass of sunshine yellow, tied to nearly everything that stood upright. Vice President Bush was there, along with Secretary of State Alexander Haig and other congressional and diplomatic leaders. But just past the official receiving line, the families waited. Fathers, mothers, sons, daughters. And when the doors of the planes opened, the waves of high emotion and pure love swept across the gray concrete runways like a summer storm. You could hear it, you could see it, you could feel it. Then onto the 16 Metro buses for the trip into town, accompanied by police cars from several area jurisdictions. Metro Media 5's Julie Lilly picks up the motorcade from there.
Quick things here before we move on to our other topic of the day. First of all, what's often missed from this is something that actually, and I almost missed it today, was something that happened in 1978, just before, well, there's a couple of things that they're missing here. I better just touch on briefly. First thing is the Egyptian-Israeli talks and the Camp David Accords. This is when you had the Six-Day War in the 1960s, and it led to a lot of hostility between Egypt and Israel. And there was an opportunity that Carter had seen to try to get a framework for peace in the Middle East. And so then they had done that. Anwar Sadat from Egypt, and I'm trying to remember who else had met. Was it Yitzhak Rabin? Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin, Jimmy Carter, and Anwar Sadat hammered out a peace treaty in 1978. So a year before, the Iran hostage crisis, this was all going on. And they agreed on a basis for peaceful settlement for the conflict between Israel and its neighbors. And that was United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. I'm not going to get into all of the bases of that, other than to say that the framework allowed for Jimmy Carter to be awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize. Because ever since then, every Democrat running for president or who's become president has had that as the goal. We're going to have peace in the Middle East because they want their Nobel Peace Prize. That's their legacy. It goes back to Carter. Jimmy Carter got a Nobel Peace Prize, and it was probably the right thing. That he probably was warranted for that moment because he worked his butt off to do that. I will give Jimmy Carter credit for that. But Bill Clinton, he never got it, but boy, he was trying. Every time you turn around, he's in the Middle East trying to make peace there somewhere. And then we had that with Obama. Obama, he got the Nobel Peace Prize, didn't earn it. So Carter's was earned. But you can't necessarily say the same about Obama's. But this is all preceding, this all preceded what happened November 4th, 1979. The other thing that happened, in addition to the Iranian Revolution, was Saddam Hussein coming to power in Iraq. Saddam Hussein comes to power, then Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini comes into power, and then next thing you know, they have the Iran-Iraq War. Now, because of the hostage crisis, the United States sided with Iraq, but then in 1990, Iraq made the play on Kuwaiti oil and then was threatening the Saudis, and that's when we came in and had a bigger military presence in the Middle East, led to Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and then all of a sudden we're still there. And we've actually done an 8-part series a couple of years ago. You can go to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/NorthStarOasis. You have to scroll down for a while, but we do have an 8-part series. I think it was called, titled How We Got Here. And, you know, we covered all of that. And so some of this is off of the top of my head from when we had covered that, but it's important because November 4th, 1979 was one of those pivot points in our history as Americans when we ended up getting bogged down in the Middle East. Remember, 1979, 1980, with Operation Eagle Claw, we were still in Vietnam mindset. Our mentality was fighting the wars in the jungle conditions of Southeast Asia. We weren't climatized for desert warfare. We changed. Now, I don't necessarily know that we could fight a jungle war if we had to again, because we've been so used to fighting and preparing to fight in the desert. So that's what's going on. So now here we have al-Baghdadi blows himself up. And this is kind of that next phase, but are we winding down? Are we having a shift that 40 years after the Iran hostage crisis that we can finally start pulling away from the Middle East? I think that's what a lot of people are hoping so. And then I will also mention other thing about Iran is that in the 1980s you had the Iran-Contra affair. And that's another thing that we're not going to cover today because we're running out of time, but nonetheless, it's still important to recognize. Anyhow, we're going to change our hat one last time because the Washington Nationals won the World Series, and since the Iran hostages returned into the Washington, D.C. area, we're going to go on over to the Washington Nationals. They won Game 7. They're the World Series champs. All World Series games this year were won on the road. First time that has ever happened. But the Nationals ended up coming up with an unofficial anthem. Yes, you heard it here, Baby Shark. Let's find out how that happened.
Baby Shark is a children's song sensation on YouTube with more than 3.5 billion views. If you've heard it, you know that it can get stuck in your head, just like that. But at a Washington Nationals game, it's not just stuck in your head. Thousands of fans are singing the song at different points in the game. Mainly, it's outfielder Gerardo Parra's walk-up song, the music that plays every time he's at bat. So how did it start? When Para joined the Nationals in May 2019, the team was in a slump. And a month later, so was he, after going hitless in almost 24 straight at-bats. During a June 19th doubleheader against the Phillies, Para decided to mix it up. He changed his walk-up song to Baby Shark because his 3 kids love it. Para went 2 for 4 that game with a home run and 2 RBIs, and got an out on former National Bryce Harper. He hasn't changed his walk-up song since. Baby Shark soon became the team's unofficial theme song. When Para is up, everyone at Nats Park does the hand signals that go along with the song. For Baby Shark, Mommy Shark, and Daddy Shark. People are so excited to sing for a simple reason. The lyrics are easy, and the hand signals are easier than line dancing. The team has also adopted the hand signals to celebrate single, double, or triple hits. And it seems like a good luck charm. The Nats went from having a 3% chance of making the playoffs to winning the National League Championship and a trip to the World Series. Even though Para isn't often in the starting lineup, fans still dress up like sharks and buy shark shirts and hats. There's even a stuffed shark wedged into the dugout net that players rub and kiss for luck. In a season full of unexpected twists, the Nats' embrace of Baby Shark is definitely the cutest subplot. They turned a children's song into a team anthem. And if they win the World Series, you will be hearing it again, and again, and again, and again.
She is absolutely right that you are going to hear it again and again and again, because right now we are going to bring you the Washington Nationals fans doing the Baby Shark dance at Nationals Park for Game 3 of the World Series.
Pitching for the catcher, Suzuki, number 88.
And yes, there's one last one, and that is, well, actually, during the game last night, they did play the Baby Shark on French horns. But we're going to actually leave you with Washington National Cathedral organists playing Baby Shark.
Hold on a minute, I gotta get it back.
Once we get it back, well, the nice thing is this is our last clip of the day, and I know that my producer doesn't like the song. I hope he's not holding out on me. All right, here is the cathedral. Full screen. Full screen. For Dallas Pearson, producer, I'm your host, Jeff Williams. You're watching North Star Oasis. Just want to remind you, we have 103 days, 6 hours, 37 minutes, and 51 seconds until pitchers and catchers report for spring training. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.